By the time most of us think about Los Angeles, we picture freeways, film studios, and an endless sprawl of light stretching to the horizon. But long before any of that existed, this place began as something far smaller, quieter, and more fragile. A river cutting through a dry valley, villages clustered along its banks, a mission, a dusty plaza, and a cluster of adobe homes on the edge of an empire. In this episode of Gilded Legacy, I'm using modern AI tools to step back into the earliest Los Angeles, from the first Spanish expeditions in 1769 to the city's transformation by 1850. We'll bring old paintings, maps, and engravings to life, shifting perspective, changing camera angles, and moving through scenes the original artists could only capture from a single point of view. The goal here isn't just to look at old images, but to move through them, to walk the streets of the original pueblo, look out over a valley still ruled by cattle and chaparral, and stand on a shoreline where ships from distant oceans once anchored off a nearly empty coast. Along the way, we'll follow how Los Angeles shifted from indigenous homeland to Spanish frontier outpost to Mexican ranching town and finally to an American city on the edge of a new kind of West. And if you stay with me until the end, we'll trace how many of these early locations still exist beneath the modern city, sometimes hidden in plain sight. This is the rise of Los Angeles, 1769 to 1850. Let's begin where the city began, with a river and a name. Before Los Angeles was a city, it was a river valley. For thousands of years, the people we now call the Tongva lived along the banks of a waterway that would later be renamed and reimagined by outsiders. Villages clustered near seasonal streams, oak groves, and the main river channel, moving with the rhythms of flood and drought. To them, this landscape wasn't empty or waiting to be discovered. It was already dense with meaning, stories, sacred places, and roots worn into the earth over generations. When the Spanish expedition led by Gaspar de Portola entered this valley in 1769, they were stepping into a world that had its own logic. Mission diaries speak briefly of friendly Indians and of villages and cultivated fields, but rarely linger on what those communities actually looked like. Today, we fill that gap by turning to archaeology, oral histories, and a few early sketches, then using AI to reconstruct plausible scenes, tule-thatched homes, communal spaces, and people gathering along the water as the sun drops behind the low hills. One of the most important moments here is surprisingly quiet. In August 1769, a Franciscan priest, Juan Crespi, looks out over the river and notes it in his journal, giving it a long, formal Spanish name honoring the Virgin Mary. El Río de Nuestra Señora, la Reina de los Ángeles de Porciúncula. He had no way of knowing that from this phrase, shortened and reshaped, an entire city would later take its name. For now, though, nothing like a city exists. Just a river, a valley, and two worlds beginning to intersect. The Tongva, who already belong to this place, and newcomers who see it as the edge of a distant empire.
A few years after that first expedition, Spain began turning this valley into a formal outpost of empire. In 1771, Franciscan missionaries established Mission San Gabriel Arcangel, a short distance from the future town site. At first, it was only a handful of buildings, a simple church, storehouses, and quarters laid out in adobe and timber. But it quickly became a center of power in the region, a place where indigenous labor, Spanish religion, and colonial authority converged. Early paintings and engravings of San Gabriel show a stark, almost isolated complex. Low white walls, a bell tower, and open fields stretching away in all directions. With AI, we can push beyond the static view. We can move through the courtyard, walk past rows of drying hides, and see Tongva people carrying water or working in orchards that did not exist here a generation earlier. The mission was more than a church. It was a machine for reorganizing the landscape. By 1781, the Spanish crown wanted more than missions. It wanted a civilian town to anchor this part of Alta California. That year, a group of 44 settlers, families of mixed Indigenous, African, and European descent from New Spain, arrived to found a pueblo along the river. They called it El Pueblo de Nuestra Señora la Reina de Los Angeles. Later generations shortened that to simply Los Angeles. The first layout was modest: a central plaza, irrigation ditches, small fields, and a rough grid of streets. Most of the early homes were simple adobes, thick earthen walls with flat roofs, built as much for practicality as comfort. Seen from above, it was less a city and more a fragile experiment, a kind of outpost clinging to the riverbank. Today, the area around Olvera Street and the El Pueblo de Los Angeles Historical Monument sits roughly where that original plaza stood. When we overlay old sketches and maps onto modern satellite views, the outline of the first pueblo still emerges, reminding us how small the city's beginnings really were. Through the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Los Angeles remained a small, somewhat isolated town. While ports like San Diego and Monterey had more direct ties to the sea, the pueblo grew slowly along the river. Early views, reconstructed from travelers' descriptions and later drawings, show a cluster of low buildings around the plaza, with open land stretching out in every direction. From a distance, church bells and a few taller structures, a chapel here, a government building there, dusty streets crossed irrigated fields, and beyond them, cattle grazed on hills brushed with sage and chaparral. It was a world still shaped more by water and soil than by commerce or industry. Inside the plaza, everyday life revolved around a small but diverse community. Soldiers from the nearby Presidio, indigenous people linked to the missions, settlers from northern Mexico, and their descendants all moved through the same space. Markets, religious festivals, and military ceremonies gave rhythm to the year. In the Boston script, meeting houses and taverns were the heart of public life. Here in early Los Angeles, that role belonged to the plaza, the nearby chapel, and the official buildings that framed them. One of the striking things, looking back with modern maps and AI reconstructions, is how empty everything still was. Beyond the compact town, the valley rolled away with only scattered ranch houses and mission outbuildings. It is hard to imagine, standing in downtown Los Angeles today, that within a short walk of the original plaza, your 18th century view would have taken in almost nothing but open country. In 1821, everything on paper changed. Mexico gained independence from Spain, and Alta California, including Los Angeles, became part of a new nation. On the ground, life in the pueblo did not transform overnight, but the rules governing land and power did. Over the next decade, the Mexican government secularized the missions, stripping them of much of their land and wealth. Those lands flowed into the hands of private individuals as large ranchos, granted to California families by Mexican authorities. Around Los Angeles, names like Rancho San Pedro, Rancho San Rafael, and Rancho La Brea began to appear on maps. Each rancho was a world unto itself: sprawling pastures, herds of cattle, adobe ranch houses, and networks of indigenous labor that reached back to the mission period. Visually, this is the moment when the landscape around Los Angeles shifts from mission-centered to ranch-centered. Instead of a single complex dominating the region, you see scattered ranch headquarters, herds spread across distant hills, and riders moving along dusty trails that connect town, mission, and rancho. From the air, if we reconstruct it with modern tools, the pueblo still looks small along the river. But now it is surrounded by a patchwork of vast landholdings, irregular shapes labeled with the names of families and saints. These ranchos laid the groundwork for future neighborhoods and property lines, long after their original owners were gone. Inside the pueblo, Mexican flags fly over official buildings, and Spanish imperial symbols quietly disappear. But daily life, the markets, the plaza, the slow rhythm of a frontier town, continues even as the economic focus tilts more and more toward cattle and hides. By the 1830s and 1840s, Los Angeles and its surrounding ranchos were tied into a wider Pacific economy. Cattle were no longer just animals on the landscape, they were part of a machine that turned hides and tallow into hard currency. Ranchos slaughtered vast numbers of animals not primarily for meat, but for their hides, which became California banknotes, and for tallow used in candles and soap. To reach foreign markets, this inland town relied on the coast at San Pedro and other nearby anchorages. Early drawings and later engravings show a striking contrast. A few ships rocking on open water off a nearly empty shoreline, small boats ferrying hides and barrels to and from the surf. There was no grand harbor yet, just a risky, exposed anchorage and a slow flow of goods from inland ranchos to the sea. Writers like Richard Henry Dana, Jr., who visited California in the 1830s, left vivid descriptions of this trade: piles of hides stacked on the beach, crews working in the surf, and the long lines of pack animals moving back and forth across the coastal plain. With AI, we can take those words and merge them with surviving coastal views, reconstructing the motion, carts bumping over rutted tracks, ships riding at anchor under changing skies. Back in the pueblo, the wealth from this trade didn't turn Los Angeles into a grand city overnight, but it did deepen the connections between local elites and foreign merchants. In adobe homes off the plaza, deals were struck over land, cattle, and future prospects. The town, still small, was now part of a network that stretched from Boston to Lima to Canton. Seen this way, early Los Angeles wasn't just an isolated frontier village. It was a quiet node in a global system, its hides and tallow helping fuel industries and households far beyond the horizon. In the mid-1840s, the world around Los Angeles shifted again, this time under the pressure of international conflict. The Mexican-American War reached California in 1846, bringing American naval forces to the coast and troops into the interior. For a time, control of Los Angeles itself seesawed, with local Californios briefly retaking the town before U.S. forces returned in strength. There are only a few contemporary images of these moments, but later paintings and engravings try to capture the drama: small groups of soldiers on horseback, dust rising from the plain, and flags changing above adobe buildings. By 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended the war, and Alta California officially became part of the United States. 2 years later, in 1850, California entered the Union as a state, and Los Angeles was incorporated as an American city. Almost overnight, maps redrew borders and official seals changed, even if the physical town still looked much as it had a decade earlier. The discovery of gold in the north sent a different kind of change rippling through the region. Los Angeles did not become a boomtown like San Francisco, but its ranchos suddenly found that their cattle were worth far more, as meat was driven or shipped north to feed miners. For a brief moment, cattle made Los Angeles wealthy, but also vulnerable to drought, overgrazing, and the bust that would come later. Los Angeles is now firmly part of the American West, its next chapter tied to railroads, land booms, and a very different kind of growth. From the perspective of modern Los Angeles, the world we've just moved through feels impossibly small. A river that now runs in concrete once meandered through a broad, seasonal floodplain. A plaza that tourists can cross in a minute once anchored a frontier community straddling Indigenous, Spanish, Mexican, and American identities. Ranchos that covered enormous swaths of land have been broken into neighborhoods, streets, and parcels that still echoed their boundaries. Using AI to step into these old paintings, maps, and engravings doesn't replace the past, but it does something else. It lets us stand inside it for a moment, to walk the dirt streets of the original pueblo, look out over open hills where freeways now run, and see ships waiting off a lonely coast, long before breakwaters and container cranes remade the shoreline. The El Pueblo district, Mission San Gabriel, and the old routes to San Pedro, all of them still exist in altered form. Next time you pass them, it might be worth pausing to imagine the smaller, stranger city that once stood here. This has been Gilded Legacy. Until next time.